Well, thank you, Monica. As you all know, Monica keeps these AI meetups alive and rather popular lately, which is nice. My name is Augustus Bacigalupi, and I started a research institute called the Institute for Augmenting Minds, and I guess I should have my notes. And I'm here to introduce the future of cognition and computation, a project I call synthetic cognition. This project in synthetic cognition will not only create a buildable project in synthetic cognition, but also the theory to test it, and I'll go over a bit of that today. So this is the Major from the Ghost in the Shell anime franchise, and you know, the future is not going to be the Hollywood-inspired us versus them. It's not going to be Terminator. It may be that to some degree, but I don't think that's really what we need to worry about. We need to worry about what we've always had to worry about, ourselves. And essentially, I think that evolution will predominantly drive us towards cyborgs. So that's essentially what this anime franchise represents. 99% of all species that have ever existed on this planet have gone extinct. So there's no guarantee for us. And the reason why they went extinct is because their form was deselected for. In other words, they either couldn't adapt fast enough, or their environment changed too quickly, and they just couldn't keep up. So the fraction of a percent that's alive today did so because we follow from a long line of successful evolution. And I argue that cyborgs is our future. Well, right. It's just a matter of time to some degree, but we have a say in that. So, so why not just do everything with machines? Often, as I go through this talk, it'll become clear that I'm certainly not against digital. I clearly like it, but I will challenge the preconception that digital alone can implement cognition, this form of cognition. In other words, the form that has evolved over billions of years. And I'd argue that people come to you and say, well, why don't you just model it in a digital computer? And one response is that, well, we're missing a huge opportunity, because clearly nature selected for this, as I pointed out earlier, for a reason. It has obvious utility, and there's something worth keeping. So here's the basic argument. There's the idea that there's two distinct forms of information processing. On this curve here, we have the Turing strategies, and on this curve here, we have evolved strategies. So we have the mosquito here, the human here on this curve, and then up there, I didn't label it, is Blue Gene, the latest one anyway, that's slated for 2012. And so on the y-axis, we have power, and on the x-axis, we have adaptive work potential. And I know some of you are thinking, well, what is that? Well, I'm going to spend the full middle of this presentation describing what that is. But for now, just understand it as the ability to do useful work within one's environment in order to increase your ability to survive. So in other words, we do work all the time in order to survive. And this is just a measure of that ability. So I argue that the mosquito is actually pretty close, or actually better than Blue Gene. Not Blue Gene, but yeah, Blue Gene. I get it mixed up with Deep Blue. And certainly humans who made Blue Gene are over here on this measure of adaptive work potential. So let's just look at scale really quickly. So here we have a picture of one of the older versions of Blue Gene taking up a room, and then for scale, one of the human technicians responsible for keeping it running. And then over here, we have, well, 2 pixels for a mosquito. It'd probably be 1 if that, but...
What's Blue Gene?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Blue Gene is a supercomputer made by IBM, and the latest one in 2012 is slated to consume 6 megawatts, and it's essentially, you could think of it as Watson. If you ever saw that Jeopardy episode where they IBM built that supercomputer to compete with 2 humans. It's essentially, it's not the exact same computer, I don't believe. I think they made a specialty computer for that, but it's essentially the same thing. It's a supercomputer. So this is just, for scale. And then you could imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, that Blue Gene no time soon is going to fly around your room trying to suck your blood, right? I mean, that's just, so we think, well, geez, if we just keep doing this, and this, eventually we'll get to the ability of a mosquito to do pretty much some amazing things. It could fly around while it's simultaneously navigating the CO2 and heat signatures in order to find you in the middle of the night. And then if it wakes you up, it can actually evade you pretty effectively. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been woken up in the middle of the night by a mosquito, and then trying to find that mosquito actually can be kind of a pain in the ass. So that's pretty impressive. So just with 100,000 neurons, it can do that. Now let's look at power. So Blue Gene consumes on the equivalent of two locomotives, which is 6 megawatts. I'm just putting order of magnitude over there just for simplicity. But the point is that there's a differential of 10 to the 10th between that mosquito that's able to do all that it's able to do and that supercomputer. Now, this isn't to say that supercomputers aren't amazingly useful and that they can't do amazing things. My argument is simply that you want to use the right tool for the right job, and that fundamentally tools are different. They're starting from a different place, they're intended for a different function, and that if we want to build this with these, then I suggest we reconsider. So what stands in our way of building a hybrid? Because ultimately the project I'm proposing is, again, not against digital, but a hybrid between the strengths of these two strategies. As I've said before, there's clear utility, otherwise we wouldn't have made these machines. But there's clear utility in this. I don't think I have to make that argument. And then if we leverage the strength of each and integrate them, that's essentially this project. So what I'm arguing that is that what it is, because essentially we don't know how it is this works. So I think you guys can grant me that. So what I'm arguing is one of the reasons why we don't understand how this works is because we really haven't engaged, we really haven't begged what it is information is. Now, information in a digital system is fundamentally discrete and independent by design. That's why they're so good at what they do. That's why they're so noiseless. That's why they can persist state so effectively. Information in cognitive systems, however, is distinct and dependent. In other words, every unit, every neuron, its behavior, it resists functional description because its output is not only based on the inputs of other synaptic neurons, but the neuroscience is unambiguous about the fact that that neuron's behavior is very sensitive to its ambient environment, its electromagnetic fields, ion gradients, etc. And I can get more into that later. But essentially what I'm arguing is these are two totally different strategies, one designed, the other evolved, to excel at different things. And using one to do what the other was evolved to do is inefficient. And I'm here to propose a different way. So why is information in cognitive systems so different? So essentially, information in nature in general is more indicative of these drops on a pond. So each drop is distinct, but the ripples that emanate on the surface of the water to create this interference pattern also creates an embodied whole. In other words, it's physically both its distinct events and their interrelations simultaneously. This isn't an abstraction. This is like just drops on the water. So we can make this a little bit more specific and talk about interformation in nature. So one of the classic problems is the n-body problem. So we have n-body problem, say, of planets. And they're very complex because the gravitational field among them is very difficult to model. And what I argue is that this interstitial terrain, the gravitational field, literally shapes space-time and literally creates a different physical reality that each individual planet both creates and is affected by simultaneously. Okay, and so this example is, here we have some water and some sand, and if you imagine 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, similarly, when the hydrogen come within proximity of the oxygen, those 2 respective electromagnetic fields superimpose to create a fundamentally different interstitial terrain, so that they're literally molding the fabric of nature, the space-time between them, to change the trajectory of their shared electrons to effectively create the higher order pattern of water. So the critical point I'm making from this ubiquitous attribute of nature is that this interstitial terrain isn't an abstraction. It's literally physically part of the system, and it's causally part of the system, both ways simultaneously. And I know someone might say, well, no, actually gravity travels at the speed of light from one point to another. That's true. But if you're a musician in a symphony, you hear every other musician, at least if they're equidistant from you, simultaneously. And I want to let that sink in for a little bit. If we can imagine that, imagine being one of those drops on the surface of a pond and there's other drops around us. Each of their ripples will reach us simultaneously, superimpose to create a combination of each of their signals simultaneously. So with this in mind, this interstitial terrain, essentially what was once the problem, in other words, what was once the n-body problem that was really hard to calculate, it becomes the solution if we just look at it as something that we can utilize, something that can be used to gather more information about the system. Then it becomes part of the solution. And again, what are we trying to solve? Well, what we're trying to solve is we have the Turing strategies that are essentially discrete states, independent by design. So they're really, well, they're not, we can have discrete states relate to each other in an abstract sense, but they don't actually physically relate by design, and that's really their strength. And so to make relationships within a discrete state system like Turing strategies, it requires ever more resources to do so. And they never create a superimposed state that's fundamentally denied to them. Whereas evolved strategies, they're messier, they're a little more noisy, but they do balance the distinct states that are observable while also creating a physical relationship between them. And this essentially is the project of synthetic cognition. How do we take the strengths of this more fundamentally relational strategy and integrate it with the strength of those discrete states into a more powerful hybrid? Okay, so that's the end of part 2. All right, so so the question is, let's bring it back to the biology. Let's bring it back to the mosquito. Okay, so how is it that the mosquito is able to do what it does, and using these interstitial terrains, the interference pattern, in order to help the mosquito do useful work within its complex dynamic environment? And the basic idea is that we all must do work to survive. All our neurons have to do work to survive. All our cells, all our institutions, all have to do work to survive. So fundamentally, work is a fundamental part of this, and I certainly appreciate a physicist's perspective on this. So in part 2, I'm going to define what adaptive work potential is. Okay, so to start this discussion, I'm going to look at work in its more familiar form and its more classical form. So work equals force through a distance. Over here we have a number of force vectors that seem to be competing with each other. It's not going to do much work. Even though you're expending energy, you're not doing much work because the forces are rather decoherent. If we cohere the forces so that they actually have a resultant vector that's going to be able to push this block in a certain direction, then we actually begin to do work. Okay, so that's great. We've cohered to do one task. That one task is to move this block some distance d. All right, now what we can imagine is that we have multiple tasks. multiple different tasks, each cohering their own function in order to achieve some goal, in this case, moving some object in a particular environment some distance d. Now the point is that these are all individual work events, each of which might be useful, and this is what I argue Norvig is after, Peter Norvig, who talked here a little while ago, is that, well, we'll just do all these separate tools and then somehow we'll figure out how cognition works out of all those separate tools, which, hey, Peter does some great work, but I'm arguing for a different approach. Now let's all those past two cases, certainly evolved cognitive animals like ourselves do those past two things, but we also do something else that's critical to adaptive work, and that's the ability to superimpose those individual tasks into one more complex task. We do this all the time. Like even me just now, I'm walking, I'm pointing, I'm talking. Each of these activities are completely dependent on each other, and the point is that our models really become messy at this point, at least this particular model of work. And the fundamental idea is that what we want to do is increase our ability to do work over time, and this is just saying at time interval AB, which precedes time interval CD, that we want to be able to do more work by being able to relate different work tasks. So, back to the mosquito. Huge fan of the mosquito. So to clear up this mess, we don't want to just model the cognitive system, we want to be that system. The mosquito can simultaneously fly, navigate a novel environment, search for you, all the while these behaviors are adaptively informing each other based on changes in the environment in real time. Again, I argue that this is pretty impressive for 100,000 neurons and 10 to the negative fourth watts. We need to understand work in a way that is simultaneously distinct, as in the distinct work tasks, and relational. In other words, the ability to relate work tasks to create ever more efficient work. So in order to do that, we need to step back and look at information differently. And you can see the clear relationship to the water ripples earlier. And here we have, so imagine that these magenta nodes are tuning forks and they're put in water. And as a C chord is made up of at least 3 notes, C, E, G, and as those come into the system, they'll resonate with some of these diversely tuned nodes. And as they resonate with some of these nodes will vibrate like a tuning fork, create an interference pattern on this imaginary surface of water to create this very distinct pattern. So like the water ripples, this interference pattern embodies both distinct events, the resonance and vibration of each of these individual nodes, and their interrelations simultaneously. In other words, the system as a whole embodies both of these forms of information. Now what we can imagine doing is creating connections between these nodes, like your standard neural net. So that we can, when these are connected, you can imagine that, say you just get a little bit of C in the note C and E, what it'll do is it'll prime the system to become more sensitive to the note G. So even if the note G is a little weak the next time around, the system will be able to recognize it, do pattern completion, and be able to respond more vigorously to future events of the C major chord within its environment. Now this is analogous to that first work diagram where we're just pushing that one box in one direction, but we can also do 2 chords. So we can take 2 completely identical networks. In other words, each of these nodes are tuned to the same resonant frequency, but in this one we can put C major, and then this one here we can put E minor. Now you can see that the patterns are completely different, but the beauty is, and this is what the former definition of work could not do, is we can superimpose them. Okay, so I want this slide to sink in a little bit because this is really important. We still have, and then we can instantiate these chords just like we did for the C major. The beauty of this is we still have C major, which is this constellation of node connectivity. We still have E minor, which is this constellation, and then their respective interference patterns are allowed to superimpose to create a third higher order interference pattern. And then you can see that these connections are beginning to form, and they're indicative of a more complex pattern. But again, we haven't lost C major and E minor. So we have both and. We have both not only the distinct notes and their interrelations, but now we have at a higher order distinct chords and their interrelations. And then you can imagine C major 7th being related with still other chords, create symphonies, et cetera, et cetera. So I argue this is fundamentally what's missing from our understanding of real-world systems. And now to understand how work physically increases, need to dig just a little bit deeper into the design. So these primary nodes, which were the magenta little dots in the former slide, like I said before, are tuned to distinct frequencies. And then as they're stimulated, say by the notes C and E, their co-stimulation will then superimpose within the interstitial space. These secondary nodes then can sense that increased activity and then digitized into the digital portion of the system, which I'll describe in a moment. The point that I want to show with this slide is what we've done is we've harvested sparse order in the noise, okay? So typically what happens with systems, like you were talking about earlier with digital systems are very cleverly designed to edit out the noise in the crosstalk. Here what we're doing is we're actually taking advantage of the crosstalk. And we're finding the sparse order and then literally harvesting it because there is sparse order in all noise, in all real noise. I mean, there's theoretical perfect noise, but this is reality. So now that we've harvested this sparse order with some real circuits.
Just a question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by sparse?
Sparse order in the sense that if you had a bunch of noise. So the question is, what do I mean by sparse order? And it's a good question because what I'm saying is that the world is mostly chaotic, mostly noisy, but then within that majority noise, there is still some order. Just like life on this planet, we could easily argue, given on our observations, that we're the minority. There may be other life, but we're the minority. What I'm saying is that the system of life has evolved to find that sparse order within the majority noise and noisy environment. Okay, just a little bit of circuit stuff. So what we need to do now is, don't let this baffle you. The important point is that we need to redefine work. We need to look at work from a different perspective. And in this perspective, we're looking at work as the integral of real power. What does that mean? So in circuits, you have current and voltage. When those two alternating currents within your circuits are in phase, you maximize the real power available. When they're out of phase, you begin to diminish the real power available. And real power is merely this curve right here, this white curve. The integral of that is just this shaded area here. And that integral is work, okay? So the point being is that the more we synchronize the activity of these nodes with the interconnections after they've harvested the sparse order, we're actually increasing our ability to do work because we're synchronizing the activity of the nodes. And I believe this is the last slide in part 2, I promise, this time. Yes. So just to sum up part 2, this is just a recap of cohering the sparse order within the chord of C major, and that before learning, the system won't respond as strongly as within this system, where these nodes, now that they have the connections and they're co-stimulated, not only do they get the energy from their environment saying, hey, I'm C major, but they also are supporting each other. They're stimulating each other, thereby having the capacity to do more work. So I'll open it up really quickly if there's...
Curious. So you model your system like if it were waves, right? Which are a linear system that you can interact, right? Then, but there are other physical systems that are like a diffusion. There is diffusion in the process, right? So you cannot model in this way. So why did you choose to model a dynamical system in this particular way, like waves that propagate in the space?
Because they can literally create. They can create this interstitial pattern that you can't really preconceive. Sure, you can make a complex model of, if I put a Gaussian distribution from any particular node because it's been stimulated, and then I model it virtually, then sure, I can create a model of how those Gaussian distributions would interact with other local Gaussian distributions. But that's fantastically computationally expensive, and this is not. And so that's essentially why I chose to do it this way. Another question? All right. So, actually, it's perfect you were just asking, what was your name? Henry. That's actually, it's a good segue to the next part, because the next part is how do we build it. So, I'd like to introduce SOARSE, which is Self-Organizing Adaptive Resonance Systems Engine, which is sort of an acronym/backronym. And so it self-organizes, as I've described before, adaptively via resonance, because each of these nodes are physically tuned to resonate with actual physical patterns within their environment. And it's a systems engine because the point of an engine is to do work. Okay, so just a quick description of what's going on. We've seen more or less this before. This is the flat plane I was showing before. This sort of I imagined as a surface of water, and then these are the magenta nodes that are resonating. In this case, instead of water, they're electromagnetic fields, and then they too create these interference patterns. And then these secondary nodes here, they just literally feel, they literally sense the state of the field in their position. And then that gets digitized, placed into the digital portion of SOARSE, which is especially adept at maintaining these values. And then with the value, the field strength in their respective positions. And that's why, I keep to your question, Mark, about I know where they are geometrically, and that's kept constant, and the digital system knows that. And then these values can then be plugged into a simple geometric method to figure out vectors between nodes. And again, the primary nodes are known to the digital system. And so those vectors are also stored in a separate matrix, and then they can be reloaded back up to the individual nodes. Now that when these are stimulated in the future, locally this node knows that it wants to ping that node over there. And so now we're sort of talking about a standard neural net model. And this will allow us, as I'll describe shortly, to do more work. And this is really where the hybrid project and synthetic cognition becomes real. So before we get there, I need to first move up in complexity a little bit. Here's that one plane we saw on the last slide, and I'm just creating multiple. Instead of just a two-dimensional array of nodes, now we're moving into a three-dimensional array. And these purple planes are just meant to abstractly indicate that there's a three-dimensional electromagnetic field, and that each of these planes is the planes that we were looking at two-dimensionally before. And that so for example, we have the C major chord coming in. It stimulates some nodes, and then that stimulation ripples through this, what I call sense mode. In this case, it's auditory, to instantiate actual distinct patterns within this one matrix. Now, one more step before we get to your question. We can have multiple matrices that are specifically sensitive to different physical phenomena in the environment. For example, we have our addition here, the word hearing apple, and then actually seeing apple here. And the only real difference is that these sensory nodes are tuned to be responsive to a different form of energy. In this case, we're looking at acoustic energy in the 10 to 20,000 hertz, and in this case, we're in the gigahertz range of electromagnetic field. Now what we can do is we have these distinct representations here of, say, the word apple, analogous to the C major chord, and then another distinct representation over here that analogous to, let's say, the E minor chord, even though it's representing a visual object. And then we can superimpose those into this interstitial matrix here. And then, like as in the brain, you have your auditory cortex and your visual cortex, and then in between is where those patterns are allowed to overlap and create higher order concepts. And so what we've...
How did you get from those networks you described to concept formation?
So the concept is, the ample concept is here. So in other words, if you remember, I had C major and E minor before, and that's superimposed into C major seventh, a more complex chord. And because this is a common medium in here, I can superimpose completely what are seeming to us to be completely different energy patterns. So for example, this sound pattern comes in and creates its own distinct pattern, like the C major chord. And then this can create its own pattern. And then those patterns can then superimpose.
Yes, but you skip to a different order of thing entirely from the things you were talking about, the concepts. How did you get to concepts? That's a different order of thing than your node analogies and your sensory networks.
Well, what
completely.
They get linked as a result of training?
They get linked, yes.
So what I'm arguing...
Is that all you're arguing that a concept
no.
is?
What I'm arguing is that the concept is a superposition of multiple percepts. So in other words, your concept of apple is composed of both tasting, feeling, seeing, the sound of the crunch when your teeth dig into it, all these different percepts of an apple superimposed to create your higher order concept of apple. And so all these different sensory matrices can send their, they retain their distinct, you still, the word apple is still distinct in my mind. It doesn't go away when it becomes superimposed with my concept of apple. Nevertheless, it can be superimposed with the vision of apple. So when I see the visual of an apple, like the connectivity that I mentioned before, the visual in that higher order portion of the brain, and I argue in this matrices, will prime the system to, it can actually recreate for itself the visual, if that makes sense.
Is this any different than neural nets and the way these things are
Well,
created?
it's similar. Yeah, it's similar to neural nets for sure. Yeah, definitely. The only or one major difference is that I'm actually dealing with superpositions of physical signals at this point. Neural nets is pure connectivity at this point, as they're...
Let me just ask again, where are you in your presentation in terms of, where are you in your presentation in terms of fielding comments and...
I'm going to answer his question about application, and that's pretty much it.
So we're on the verge of
wrapping up.
Free for all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Good. Okay. I've got a lengthy historical discourse on your concepts, and I'll just say that to affirm what you're saying, you're in the company of illustrious colleagues in the history of neurobiology with what you're presenting.
I'm a huge fan of
neuroscience. More on that in a minute.
Yeah, well, and we'll come back to you because, I will point out just really quickly, I mean, this has really been largely inspired by neuroscience. I mean, largely what led up to these schematic designs and the theory itself was going to Helen Will's neuroscience lecture series and hanging out with those guys, and it was very informative, and I'd love to work with the guys over the Redwood Institute for sure. But let me wrap this up so that we can get to the free-for-all. So advanced robotics. Here's addressing your question about, okay, well, why does this matter? What can it do? So imagine a completely foreign terrain such as Mars. Messages take about 8 minutes to get from Houston to Mars and then back. And that doesn't even count the time that the system actually has to try and do something in response to that command that took 8 minutes to get there. So in this example, we have the Spirit rover, which last year, or a couple years ago, it got stuck. And it was a rather laborious project for Houston to try and, I believe it was Houston, try and try something to get it out of the sand and then see how it worked and wait another 8 minutes. It's just a rather laborious process, and a fair bit can happen in 16 minutes. You know, it could slip further. The real-time situation on the ground can really change. So what SOARSE will do is contribute, not replace the digital system, but contribute to the ability for an autonomous agent like a robot on Mars to be able to do more work, more effective work, and solve real-world problems in real time autonomously. And so let's take a look at that with SOARSE. So what SOARSE does is it can essentially embody any manner of relevant signals, whether it be the environmental percepts that I was talking about earlier, but it can also create patterns for internal progress towards goal, internal power efficiency, haptic sense from any number of limbs and wheels, etc. And the beauty is that all of these now can be superimposed into, for lack of a better word, feelings. So in a sense, and I mean that in a very rigorous sense, that each of these respective patterns still have their own distinctness. They still exist within the system. They aren't erased like bits would be erased, but they retain their own distinctness, but they can also be superimposed. And the beauty of that is that they fundamentally become related, and those relations can be leveraged to send back to the digital portion to help make better decisions in real time. So just to wrap up, and I'm sure you guys have a number of questions, but just to sum up, again, what we're trying to do is take what it is has evolved over billions of years, the obvious strategies, the abilities to navigate. We just take for granted that a 4-year-old can certainly navigate the world pretty much better than anything Google's come up with so far. So, maybe there's something there. I'm just arguing that there is, and the neuroscience and the physics support that claim, and that Turing strategies are clearly useful, and there's strengths to each. And that what we need to do is integrate those into a more powerful hybrid. And that hybrid then will be able to be integrated with existing technologies and existing organisms to move us closer to cyberdization, which in essence is evolution. Thanks.